Almost everyone with a television, cable, or even a good internet connection has probably watched The Shawshank Redemption many times. Very few films can boast such widespread acclaim as this one. The directing is absolutely brilliant, the story is powerful, and the acting is superb. It remains a classic that will never go out of style, even after nearly 3 decades. Consider, however, that it hardly generated a stir upon its 1994 theatrical debut. Despite its enduring popularity, this masterpiece bombed at the box office. However, it became one of the most acclaimed films of all time at some point. That is only one of the many unexpected turns in Shawshank and #039's plot that the majority of viewers are unaware of. From the original title Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption to every detail, we in #039'll be revealing everything in this video about this hidden gem. Took its moniker from one of the famous posters shown in Andy Dufresne and #039's prison cell. The film version, however, is far from faithful to the source material. Frank Darabont, who was responsible for both writing and directing the screenplay, let his imagination run wild in bringing the plot to life. Darabont added to and altered King and #039's original storyline as it went from novella to cinema. A more in-depth examination of the psychological fallout of incarceration is one example. In example, the horrible end that befalls Brooks in the novella is downplayed. The villains, such as Warden Norton, take on a darker tone throughout the film, which enhances the satisfaction of seeing them fall from grace. Thankfully, none of these happenings or personalities were inspired by actual persons, even if they may easily exist in real life. Changing Morgan Freeman and #039's character, Red, was one of the most noticeable changes. Red is portrayed as a red-headed Irishman in King and #039's narrative, but Freeman and #039's mesmerizing portrayal elevated the character to a new level of relatability. The ending is another famous change. Despite King and #039's ambiguity, the film gracefully concludes with Red and Andy reuniting. In addition to giving the audience reason to be hopeful, this decision cemented The Shawshank Redemption and #039's status as an all-time great film. The actual cause, however, remains unknown to the majority. Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption is the working title of the Stephen King novella, which was almost used for the movie posters but ultimately was cut. Then why was there a shift? Yeah, director Frank Darabont was right when he said the title may trick people into thinking it was a Rita Hayworth biopic. As you may recall, agents contacted Darabont to urge their clients to play Hayworth. Plus, a handful of aspirants made an appearance at the studio, prepared to try out for a role that never was. Darabont abbreviated the title to keep things simple, which served to clarify things and made the film and #039's moniker stick. Although Dufresne did find inspiration in King and #039's book, it wasn't in #039's sole source. Filming for The Shawshank Redemption took place at a real Ohio prison, even though Shawshank is a work of fiction. The plot takes place in Maine, but the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, where a lot of the filming happened, gives it an incredibly realistic feel. Built between 1886 and 1910, this massive building housed innumerable convicts and stories until its closure in 1990. Tango and Amp, Cash, Air Force One, and many others have used the reformatory as a backdrop since it closed. Today, it and #039's a popular tourist destination where fans can experience what it was like to walk in Andy and #039's red shoes. The fact that it was set in a real prison gives the story more credibility. The bleak passageways and weathered stone walls provide the impression that what is happening on screen is happening in real life, erasing any distinction between fact and fantasy. The Shawshank Redemption and #039's widespread appeal is understandable. It took some time for the project to get steam after Darabont bought the film rights to Stephen King and #039's book in 1987, but now it feels like the plot could have unfolded in a place exactly like this. After putting off writing the script for 5 years, he eventually got down to the task. The task in a remarkable 8 weeks. Castle Rock Entertainment saw his script submission 2 weeks after he put in the time and effort. To make The Shawshank Redemption a reality, he managed to negotiate a budget of $25 million. Beginning in January 1993, preparations were made to create the framework for an acclaimed film classic. The Shawshank Redemption and hashtag 039's casting procedure included. When casting for the part of Andy Dufresne first began, director Frank Darabont considered A-list Hollywood actors. Legends such as Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall were on his radar, but they weren't and hashtag 039's accessible. Paul Newman and Clint Eastwood were among the other A-listers. Kevin Costner, Tom Hanks, and Tom Cruise were all offered the part, but they all declined. Costner had committed to Waterworld, and Hanks had a lot on his plate with Forrest Gump. At one point or another, Johnny Depp, Nicolas Cage, and Charlie Sheen were all being considered. Although Cruise did sit in on a table read, he was not enthusiastic about collaborating with Darabont, a first-time director. Tim Robbins and hashtag 039's performance in the psychological thriller Jacob and hashtag 039's latter had a lasting impression on Darabont, who finally cast him. Insisting on the inclusion of Roger Deakins, a celebrated cinematographer he had collaborated with on the Hudsucker Proxy, Robbins brought his distinctive style to the part. Robbins studied up on the concept of confinement by hanging around with prison guards and inmates and watching captive animals, going so far as to isolate himself for a few of hours in order to enter Andy and hashtag 039's mental state. The effort was worthwhile since Robbins gave a performance that was powerful in its subtlety. You may say that contributed to The Shawshank Redemption becoming the classic film that it is today. To continue with the subject of casting, Morgan Freeman actually was and hashtag 039's considered at all during the initial stages of casting. Reason being, Stephen King and hashtag 039's novella depicted Red as a red-haired Irishman, a label that plainly did not apply to Freeman. Paul Newman and Clint Eastwood, two Hollywood icons, were instead considered. The idea of using Freeman didn't and hashtag 039's occur to producer Liz Glotzer until she proposed being creative. A sense of destiny seems to have played a role. Freeman had a minor but noteworthy appearance in Robert Redford and hashtag 039's 1980 prison drama Brubaker, which led director Frank Darabont to unknowingly respect Freeman and hashtag 039's performance. It and hashtag 039's almost like the cosmos was trying to bring them together. It all came down to Freeman and hashtag 039's casting, which changed the outcome. Regarding both the picture and his career in general, it was a huge break for him, as it was his first voiceover part in a feature picture, and it introduced him to a new career path. He cemented his position in cinematic history with his depiction of Red, which became one of his most memorable performances and earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Imagine instead that the crew came up with a brilliant technique to make Morgan Freeman look younger without using digital effects or asking for old images. They utilized images of Freeman and hashtag 039's own kid. Thus, Alfonso Freeman, who was 35 years old when those youthful red mugshots appear on his parole documents, is truly what you and hashtag 039 re-looking at. The Shawshank Redemption has more than just the cameo by Alfonso. He makes an appearance later on in the film, teasing the newcomers, including Andy, in his role as a prisoner to Shawshank on their initial evening there. He played a juvenile version of his renowned dad and hashtag 039's persona and a riotous convict in his first film credit. That is an interesting approach to joining the family business. When we in hashtag 039 rediscussing money, Frank Darabont acquired the rights to adapt Stephen King and hashtag 039's short story for next to nothing. The Dollar Baby program was introduced by King in 1977, inviting would-be directors to purchase the rights to adapt his short stories for $1. A $5,000 payment was sent to King by Darabont as a token of appreciation after The Shawshank Redemption became a critically acclaimed film. But King, who had a reputation for being eccentric, passed on the opportunity. Rather than that, he resent Darabont the framed check along with a message that read, end quote, "In case you ever need bail money, love Steve," end quote. Don and hashtag 039 blame them. The Shawshank Redemption and hashtag 039's production company, Castle Rock Entertainment, has an appropriate relationship to Stephen King and hashtag 039's body of writing. The town is named after the imaginary one that appears in numerous of King and hashtag 039's tales. Frank Darabont found the ideal venue to present his adaptation of King and hashtag 039's story at Castle Rock, which was co-founded by Rob Reiner, director of Stand By Me. With Tom Cruise in the role of Andy Dufresne and Harrison Ford as Red, Reiner offered $2.5 million to purchase Darabont and #039's screenplay in its entirety. To Cruise in #039's dismay, Reiner would play no active role, which piqued his interest. Even more famous people declined to be involved with the initiative. Before deciding to star in Thelma and Louise, Brad Pitt was set to portray Tommy. James Gandolfini, meanwhile, turned down the part of Boggs to focus on true romance. In the end, the picture assembled its own legendary cast, and the rest is cinematic history. Morgan Freeman and #039's legendary narration for The Shawshank Redemption was already recorded before filming began, which is only one of the many reasons why the picture came out flawless. It wasn't in #039's merely a matter of editing that the inmates and #039's drinking on the roof scene matched so well with Freeman and #039's narration. On set, director Frank Darabont reran the recorded narration so that the performers could respond to it as it was happening. Nevertheless, a small issue arose. The original recordings were useless for the final version due to tape hiss and bad sound quality. Even though Freeman had to re-record all the narration after filming wrapped, the final product was so polished that no one would have suspected anything was wrong. The project did, however, face additional challenges. Keeping one and #039's concentration during filming was a major challenge. There was a lot of pressure to get it perfect as, despite many tries, only the last take was in focus. This tight framing was crucial because it shows Andy embracing his newfound freedom upon his release from prison. In addition to the focus issues, the crew had to deal with the added challenge of filming in the rain. Careful preparation and coordination were required to achieve the ideal lighting balance, which amplified the dramatic effect without overpowering the scene. The creek that was used for the filming was in no way perfect. Standing for long periods of time in dirty water was not only unpleasant, but also potentially harmful to Robbins and #039's health. Since Robbins had to keep the same emotional state and posture for each take, the cold water only made things worse. His difficulties were exacerbated by the necessity of being emotionally genuine and the physical exhaustion of standing in the rain. The stakes were higher for Robbins and the rest of the crew because of the emotional gravity of the situation. Thanks to the hard work and expertise put into filming it, this sequence is now considered a classic. You might make the same argument regarding the moment where Andy and Red had their initial chat, as Red, played by Morgan Freeman, was seen batting back and forth during filming. It may not seem like much at first, but the physical strain was substantial. Without a single word of complaint, Freeman pushed through the exhausting hours. But the continual throwing was so taxing that he showed up to set the following day with a sling on his arm. That was the most challenging aspect of the scene, but there was more to it than just throwing a ball. It was a watershed event that laid the groundwork for Andy and Red and #039's profound friendship. The filmmakers had to work together with pinpoint accuracy to get the perfect shots that conveyed the proper feelings. The goal of each rendition was to emphasize how well the two characters got along. Even though they had to practice it several times, they managed to make their talk flow smoothly. This extended shot echoes the film and #039's themes of perseverance and camaraderie. Freeman and the crew and #039's unwavering commitment not only produced an unforgettable scene, but also set the stage for the story and #039's central conflict. Even now, people are moved by how effectively that scene portrays their bond. It and #039's very remarkable how much of an impact The Shawshank Redemption has had since its initial release. Actually, with a budget of $25 million, The Shawshank Redemption performed poorly at the box office upon its initial release, earning only approximately $16 million. This difficult start was caused by a number of things. To begin with, the year was 1994, which was jam-packed with popular films like Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump. The box office was ruled by these mega hits, succeeding beyond Shawshank. From the get-go, its popularity was probably limited due to the title and the fact that it took place in a prison, neither of which resonated with audiences seeking lighter or more commercial content. It may have been more difficult for Shawshank to attract audiences because many individuals could have preferred lighter or more exciting fare. Nothing came of the advertising campaigns either. Shawshank didn't and #039 T received nearly as much publicity as other films that were supported by more robust advertising efforts. Because of the film and hashtag 039's themes and its slow burn storytelling approach, this lack of visibility was made more worse. And that could have made some viewers crave a more thrilling or action-packed experience. Mystifying, though, is the film and hashtag 039's resurgence following its first release. With time, The Shawshank Redemption started to take on the qualities of a legendary film. The compelling story and nuanced acting were eventually recognized by the public, causing it to be acknowledged as one of the best films of all time. This happened for a variety of reasons, one of them being that, in 1993, Ted Turner bought Castle Rock Entertainment, so the ownership changed. Incorporating Castle Rock and hashtag 039's films, including Shawshank Redemption, into Turner Broadcasting System. The film and hashtag 039's prominence was completely transformed by this ownership. Shawshank began to air on TNT with remarkable regularity once Turner took over. Airing it cost very nothing. Because of this, it was a natural fit for the network and hashtag 039's airtime allocation. Shawshank ended up becoming one of those classic cable films that people would regularly stumble upon. You won and hashtag 039's be able to tear yourself away from this film once you start viewing it. With 15 separate basic cable networks airing it by 2013, it was one of the most aired films in cable history. The film was able to reach a larger audience because of this continuous exposure, turning it into a cherished classic that many fans adore, turning it around from a box office underachiever. As time went on, it became an ingrained part of moviegoing culture, demonstrating that films can succeed when given the proper opportunity. For example, in April of 2018, on an episode of it and hashtag 039's Spin a Minute with Sam Sanders, which airs on NPR, Tim Robbins discussed his feelings on The Shawshank Redemption. He went on to say that he frequently meets random people who rave about the movie. Robbins still takes great delight in being a part of something that touches people and hashtag 039's hearts, even after all this time has passed. The bond that followers share with Shawshank goes beyond just admiration, he said. Their lives are genuinely affected. A lot of people have come to him with personal stories of how the movie changed their outlook, helped them get over obstacles, or revealed more profound aspects of who they are. As the actor puts it, you and hashtag 039, in my favorite movie of all time, he says that feedback like this is common and very special. Being a part of such a groundbreaking film must have seemed like a huge achievement for Robbins, like crossing something off a bucket list. Many people and hashtag 039's lives have been profoundly affected by The Shawshank Redemption because of the profound emotional connection it forms with its audience.